If you want to go ahead and open for Bibles, we're going to be looking at Colossians chapter 1 for this particular lesson. So Colossians chapter 1, and really we're going to spend most of our time really just kind of tracing arguments, because I think that's the most important thing with epistles, is being able to trace the argument. And, Jeremy did a great job of tracing the argument today with all these things. I'm just going to throw in some things like some fors and buts and therefores and things like that to kind of give us our hints and our cues of where those points are. All right. So, said we're in our final lesson, epistles. This one I left to last because it is, it's the one that kind of requires the most detail work. Those are fun days, right? We all have those. All right. So, other than poetry does require a lot of detail work, but epistles especially. And they're like everything else. The reason we're doing these as an individual thing is because they are unique in that how you approach them. Right? They're not like the histories. They're not a narrative that goes out and tells a story. They're not poetry. They're not prophecy. They're not any of those other things that we've covered. There's something a little different. And essentially, epistles are letters to either individuals or a church, right, or a group of churches. There's arguments that are made that the book of Ephesians is actually to all the churches. The book of Revelation is to 7 churches. It's either to a church or an individual, and the point of them is to actually be read all at once. So as we're studying them, if the point is to kind of be all at once, we need to understand what's the overarching argument, what's the overarching point that comes with that, right? And so they have that overall point. It's all built into it, and all of the arguments that are within it flows back to that main point. Right, so last week we talked about Ephesians. That's the nice thing about doing epistles as a book overview, because they do have those things, and you can kind of pull all those things back. And the big argument there is no separation between Jew and Gentile anymore. We're in one nation, right? And so, and all of those arguments flow back to that main point, right? And generally speaking, the Pauline epistles follow at least the ones to the churches, follow this idea of theology first, followed by practical application. And so that's an important thing. And the point in this, and it's the same point in all the letters that he does, is the orthodoxy, the theology that we have, informs and shapes the orthopraxy, the practice, what we do. So our theology shapes our actions. Right, that's what it should be. I used to tell my kids, I was teaching youth all the time, it was every week, in this, in the thing, theology that doesn't shape your life is just empty words. Right? So it has to go somewhere, and that's where Paul's letters go. The letters to the individuals are not quite like this. You usually are shorter, and they are kind of interweaved with theology and practical. They're more practical than your epistles that are to the church. So that's an important aspect to remember. And unfortunately, Paul's arguments are not super linear. They are incredibly circular in the sense that, and I don't mean, so circular reasoning is a logical fallacy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about he just continues to come back to the point, right? And it's partially influenced by that. We've talked about it a couple times, the idea of chiastic structure, that it goes into the main point and then back out. But you'll see Paul come back to the same point over and over and over again, which is, I think I remember Jeremy a couple of times saying through the book of Galatians, we've already hit this point, but he hits it again, so we're going to hit it again. So that's kind of the way Paul writes. It's very come back to it. It's not like what we write today, the paragraph structure where you have point, 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 point. So you got to kind of decipher it a little bit more. And I think understanding that, because sometimes reading Paul's epistles is really difficult. You get through and try to figure, where in the world is he going with this? And so understanding that circular idea. And then, again, some of the things we'll talk about, the idea that the premise and conclusion indicators, those are actually really, really helpful premise and conclusion indicators. So they're gonna point you in the direction that you need to go, which is the point of them. That's the purpose they're there for. Anyways, the emphasis in personality. So Paul isn't the only one that writes letters, and we can see some differences in personality. So you don't take the way Paul writes and apply it directly to the way some of these others. But these tools that we're going to talk about today, they're universal. They're going to work throughout either Paul's or whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, or that's the only one we don't really have an author for is Hebrews, or Peter or John or Jude or any of the epistles, any of them who wrote these different epistles. These ideas will still come out. And some of it does apply because the writing style is somewhat cultural, right? And so you'll see similarities, and that circular thing does apply a little bit more. Peter is a little bit more linear. He's a little easier to follow sometimes. Yes, all these tools, again, will do this. So first of all, we need to get into what is the context, right? That's always really important when we're digging into a text. And in this one, the context primarily is going to be about who wrote it and who did they write it to, right? And so the who wrote it is, it's going to be in the first couple of letters with it, like I said, the exception of Hebrews. There are a lot of fun theories on the book of Hebrews, who wrote that. But that's going to help us kind of determine, because if we know who wrote it, what we can do is when we get stuck somewhere and we're like, I really don't know what he means here, we can find parallel passages and other things in different letters that they wrote and kind of compare and contrast and see if we can't help fish out that meaning a little bit. So understanding who is important. We also want to know who it was written to, because personal letters, like I said, are a little different from letters to the churches. All of them are intended to be read outright, just read straight through. So that's they all have kind of these overarching points, overarching flowing ideas. But something that's personal is going to have a little bit, or it's more practical, a little bit different way of looking at it. Whereas the ones that are written to the churches, like I said, more emphasis on the theology early before you get to the practical, right? And I think the assumption there on my part is that when we get to these epistles, they're writing to people they know. They already know where they stand in the theology, so they don't need to express that. We want to, and again, I think one of the most helpful things when you're looking through any epistle is to just read through the whole thing first. Read it all at once. Don't try to break it into pieces until you've gone through the whole thing. And I didn't mention this, I meant to mention this last week with the minor prophets as well. It's helpful to do that with them. And I like to read through the whole thing. And there's, if you guys aren't familiar, Bible Project has done a great job of offering really good summaries for every book of the Bible. And I definitely recommend hitting that and kind of looking at their summary of whatever it is to kind of before you, because that will help lay out the groundwork a little bit to help. You might have already seen some of these things as in your read through, and you'll notice. I noticed that when I'm watching it after I read through a text, I'll just okay, I didn't notice that. I missed that connection, and you'll see some things that somebody else who's done a lot of study on it will help kind of bring those out. And so, again, we want to know. The big point of reading the whole thing before you start digging into it is to understand what's the big problem that's being addressed, right? And study Bibles can help with that too, because they'll list it in that little paragraph at the beginning. What's the big problem? And so those are really, we want to understand what is the overall point? What is the problem addressed, right? So like Galatians, we hit it today, the idea of circumcision, and basically you have to follow the law. That was the problem. Colossians is about identity and making sure it's kind of the same idea. Don't fall to this false teaching, but it's more tied rather than law versus grace like Galatians. It's more tied into who you are, and you are in Christ. So it changes everything, which is in Galatians, but it's more emphasized in Colossians. Right, and so as we're looking through Colossians and talking about these arguments, that's where it's kind of coming back to is like this is who you are, right? It's defining who we are as people, as Christians. So, and after we've done all that, we got that overall point. The other piece of context that we want to understand is when we're digging into a particular passage, we need to look behind it and ahead of it. We want to look at what came just before it. What's the passage that immediately, what was the point of the passage that immediately came before it, and what was the point of the passage that came, because that will help inform, how we interpret those. One of the most misused chapters in the Bible is 1 Corinthians 13, right? Used all the time at weddings, right? Has nothing to do with weddings. It has everything to do with the right ordering of the church, right? And how we're supposed to love with one another within the church and how we use spiritual gifts and things of that nature. So, understanding where it is in the flow, some of the verses are very, they work. I don't want to, if anybody used that at your wedding, it's not that big a deal, but it is not the context that it's in, right? And so, we want to understand what came before it, what came after it, because it's going to help dictate what this particular passage means, right? And that's how arguments work. Is like they flow through in that way. So, so that's your context, and that one would be our first one. We got some of those questions there. The overall point. What are the major problems addressed? Who's the audience? Of course, and I didn't put it in there, should have, but what comes before and after it, right? Are the kind of major questions you want to be asking in that section. Now, when we look at what does it say, this is where we're going to spend the majority of the time, right? Because what does it say is the challenging part here. We're trying to figure out how does this argument flow, right? Once we figure out how the argument flows, the meaning will come out of that, and we'll be able to kind of dig into that. And remember, the meaning means one thing. It means one thing that author intended it to mean. We're not trying to assign meaning to it. We're trying to figure out what he said and what he meant when he said it. So when we're asking what does it say, we want to trace that arguments. We're looking for these premise and conclusion indicators. All right, and those I taught logic for about 9 years, and this is, if you count all the summer classes I did, probably like 20. But one of the things we cover is the idea of a premise indicator and a conclusion indicator. And the idea that the conclusion indicators are, I've got them listed on this note sheet, therefore, for this reason, thus, so, one that you won't see in Scripture necessarily unless a new translation comes out that uses it is ergo. That's a fun one. I always love that one, but nobody ever uses it. Jeremy, that's your task now. Next week you have to use ergo. But those are and I want to define conclusion tells us the what. It's the point, right? What is the point? That's the what, and then the premise indicators, for, since, because, things of that nature. Those tell us the why, right? So you're getting this argument of, whenever we see therefore, we want to know what it's there for, okay? We want to see, therefore tells us the point, so we read the point, this is the point, and then we go back before that and try to figure out what is the reason for the point, right? And that's how we're tracing these arguments through here. So if we look at Colossians, and we can honestly, you can pick anywhere in this text. This is why I picked Colossians. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, so premise indicators would be, and both of these would be at the beginning of a sentence. They would be things like, let me see if I can real quick grab one out here. Okay, yeah, verse 19 in Colossians chapter 1. It says, for in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So that's a reason, and we want to look back before that and see what was the point and so the point there is he's the head of the body of the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. So he was preeminent. He's great because, and you could even change those words out, right? For, because, those can be changed out, and that tells you in him all the fullness of God. So he was preeminent because God dwelled in him, right? So that's kind of how we're breaking down these arguments. We want to see, and having conclusion indicators is really helpful. Having premise indicators and conclusion indicators really help us to kind of line these out, right? So we have so is one that I use all the time unwittingly. That's my nervous tick, right? Everyone has one of those. We do or whatever. Mine is so. So sometimes you'll hear in my sermons so. Now you're going to be, well, my mother does, and she will tell me. So, but yeah, it's, you definitely keep me on track. That actually is helpful if you can. But hey, you use so too many times. Maybe I should put that on the sermon notes sheet. Yeah, we'll just put so on there. That's all right. But so is another one, and in verse 9 of chapter 1 and verse 10, you got so twice, right? And so, and when you have and so together, that's a really clear one. That's a conclusion. Just like therefore, just like thus, and so. And so you would go back to that. You see what the point is. From the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you. Okay, so the point is, we've heard, we're praying for you. So we go back before that and see why are they praying. And it talks about they learned from Epaphras, and he's a faithful minister, and he made known to them their love in the Spirit. So he prays for them because they have love in the Spirit, right? And so that's kind of how those kind of connect, right? And we can kind of keep tracing these arguments. And the great thing is, if we start kind of using these and pull these little different premises and conclusions and kind of connect these dots, we can go back and re-articulate the argument in different words, right? So what I'd like to try to do real quick, let's move to chapter 2. I've walked through this book a few times doing kind of this. Actually, one of the assignments, our last final assignment for my logic classes was to go through the book of Galatians doing this, tracing these things, but we already did Galatians, so we need to do Colossians instead. So what we'll do, let's look at just chapter 2, 6 through 15. And let's take 5 minutes and kind of look at what we've got and see the premise and conclusion indicators. Why don't we do it this way? Yeah, let's just do that, and then we'll come back and kind of talk through what some of these different points and reasons are, because we want to understand the why and we want to understand the what. What's the point? Why is that the point? So let's look through that and see what kind of premise and conclusion indicators we got, and then, hey, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and turn up let's just turn the music lightly up just for a couple minutes. Oh, but we have to pause the recording for that. Just pause the recording. Because they'll copyright us.